for all us plant nerds or plant professionals out there. Um, with all that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. We have Dr. Carol Frost, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Renewable Resources at the University of Alberta. She is an arthropod community ecologist with a focus on biodiversity conservation. And today's topic is choosing flower species for restoration of beneficial insect biodiversity, community level flower preferences, and flower visiting insect responses to native versus non-native flowers. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Frost.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak in this seminar series. I'm excited to share with you some of our work on the topic of choosing flower species for restoration of beneficial insect biodiversity. I'd like to begin by thanking all of the students whose work this really is, as well as my collaborators and funders. So pictured here are Sydney Worthy, Pilar Jimenez Ronquencio.
Just need you to share your screen again there, Carol.
Oh, okay.
And I guess I should add quickly too that if you do have questions, you're welcome to throw them into the chat, and we'll after the presentation there'll be a time to go through those as well.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Oh, yep. Okay, excellent.
And if you just put it in presenter mode, then we should be there.
Now,
perfect.
Does that look right?
Yeah, that
you're
looks
all
right.
set.
Okay, great. Away we go. Well, I'd like to just thank all of these students who have done this work, as well as John Acorn, who's a co-supervisor of 2 of these students, and the funders of this research, who have been the Alberta Conservation Association, NSERC, EPCOR, MITAX, Future Energy Systems, and the University of Alberta Rangelands Research Institute. And I'm going to talk about each student a bit more as we get to their work. So this talk is about the question, how to restore a grassland for pollinators. And my experience with this, I'm not a restoration ecologist, but I've gotten a close look at this process through the restoration of this solar farm, Kiziga Pisim. Now this is owned by EPCOR, and it's a solar farm in the river valley of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And it was constructed to provide half of the power needed to power their water distribution plant. Now, when you construct a solar farm, like other industrial projects in grasslands, it involves a total clearing of vegetation. So some level of restoration is needed if you would like to have vegetation and biodiversity back on the land once you've completed the industrial construction. So EPCOR viewed the construction of this as an opportunity to study restoration for pollinators, and they made that one of their objectives. So the first question is, well, if we want to support pollinators, of course we need to provide flowers, because that is what provides food for pollinators. So the big question is, what flower species should be used in restoration for pollinators? Now the answer to this depends on whether we're talking about a garden, whether you're planting just a small area that you want to be an area that provides flowers for pollinators, or whether you're talking about an industrial site or other very large area. Now, if you're just talking about a garden, so a small area, lots of flowers for pollinator guides exist. And this is an example put out by the Alberta Native Bee Council that is suggesting wildflowers to plant for Alberta's wild bees. And so I've drawn a red box around the species suggested, and then it gives information like the bloom period, flower type, growing conditions. Basically, if you're planting a small area for pollinators, diversity is the goal. Diversity of flower colors, phenologies, so blooming periods, other morphological traits, because the more diversity of flowers you have, the more diversity of flower visiting insects you can support. Many of these flower lists for pollinators exist. Here's one for the region where the solar farm is, the Aspen Parkland ecoregion, put out by the Pollinator Partnership Canada. Now, that's great that we have so many of these lists, but this paper was published in 2014, which roundly criticizes these flower lists for pollinators. So this paper is called List Mania, the strengths and weaknesses of lists of garden plants to help pollinators. And these authors collected flower lists for pollinators in the UK and Europe, and looked through them and looked for what is the basis for these lists. Why are these flowers being recommended for pollinators? And what they say in this review paper is that almost no flower list for pollinators provides the rationale for having put those flowers on that list for pollinators. So it's very hard to know. So not knowing why a flower is on the list means that you're less able to judge between the flowers on the list because some lists have very many flowers on them. We found 23 flower lists for Alberta, and these lists recommended anywhere from 6 to 107 different flower species. So if you're trying to use your limited budget to select the best flowers for pollinators in an industrial setting, it maybe isn't quite informative enough. It doesn't give you a very good basis for choosing between these 6 or between these 107 flower species. So what did EPCOR do at their solar farm? And this is a photo of under the solar farm, which this area they seeded with grass, and then they had along the fences, so not under the solar panels, they planted 2 native forb seed mixes, which were meant to be the pollinator supporting areas of the solar farm. Then an important part was doing weed management and monitoring of the revegetation success. Because for anyone who has tried to seed and get to establish native forbs in Canadian grasslands, you know that as soon as you plant them, weeds grow. Non-native grasses, non-native forbs. And what we normally do if we're just trying to establish grasses is we spray herbicide, which kills the weeds and allows grasses to grow. But if you're trying to seed native forbs, you can't use herbicide in the same way, at least. You can't just spray it everywhere. You have to either spot spray it on weeds, or you have to hand pull weeds or mow strategically. So getting native forb species to grow is very resource intensive. The solar farm also provided bee nesting habitats, but I'm going to focus in this talk on this part, getting flowers to grow for native pollinators. So this was the seed mix, the first seed mix that EPCOR used. We've got the scientific name here for grasses and forbs, and then the common name. So they selected 10 or 11 native forbs. Then they had planned to have a second seed mix in other areas, again to promote diversity. So provide some flowers in some areas, some other flowers in other areas, which had another list of forbs. However, now this is the problem that this talk is really addressing. When they went to actually try to obtain the seed for these lists that they wanted to plant, they couldn't get most of these species. So their pollinator seed mix 1 was completely substituted species. So they couldn't get any of the ones that they had wanted to get. Their seed mix 2 also had some substitutes, and so the forbs are in this red highlighted area. The seed mix 2 had almost exactly the same species as seed mix 1, only these 2 species were in seed mix 1 and not seed mix 2. So this experience of EPCOR's, that they had this great plan to provide a diversity of native forbs for pollinators, but they couldn't get the seed, is a big problem in industrial restoration projects in grasslands in this part of the world. Now, commercial development of native seed for forbs is an active area of work. Inotech Alberta is doing a lot of this. I led and worked on by Marshall McKenzie, among others. So far, however, limited quantities and numbers of species are available, as EPCOR discovered in their attempt to purchase their desired seed mix. So given these problems, limited native seed availability, at least in industrial quantities, and how resource intensive it is to get native forbs to establish, especially over large land bases, I wanted to know which flower species have the highest pollinator community supporting function. Because if we're going to invest all these resources in commercially developing native flower seed, and then all the resources in getting it to establish, we might as well be as strategic as possible in selecting forbs that are going to have the best possible pollinator supporting function. And not just any one pollinator, because there are actually thousands of species of insects that visit flowers in this part of the world. So ideally, we want to support a diversity of pollinators, meaning many species of pollinators. So So that's the goal of this research, is can we find out which flower species have the highest pollinator community supporting function? So, and if we could find such flowers, these should be the ones that we should focus on commercial seed development for, because we would get the most restoration bang for our buck in terms of our goal of restoring pollinator communities if we could develop seed for these species. So a flower species with high pollinator community supporting function should be preferred by many pollinator species. Now, the assumption here is that pollinators will prefer to visit flower species that provide resources that are good for them in some way. Either they're more nutritious, or that flower is easier to handle to access the resources, so less energy is spent obtaining them. So we're assuming that pollinators know what's good for them by saying this. But here we go. Can we figure out which flowers are preferred by pollinator species? Now, I want to start out by talking about the concept of preference, because this is gets a little bit slippery when you start expanding it to a community. So first of all, here's a picture of how we might conceptualize flower preference. So we have a community of 3 flower species, 2 flower species, 4 flower individuals. 3 of the individuals are one species and 1 individual is another species. The 4 pollinators in the area mostly want to choose that one individual, the species that has only 1 individual. So this suggests a preference on the part of this pollinator for this flower species, because they're selecting it disproportionate to its availability. So this is usually how we conceptualize preference in ecology. We say a resource is preferred when it's visited more than can be expected based on its availability relative to other flower species. Because if all of these pollinators were just visiting these flowers proportionate to their availability, we wouldn't have evidence that they actually prefer that species. Maybe they're just visiting it because they encounter it and it's available, so they're using it. It shows no sign of preference if they're visiting in proportion to availability. So to be preferred, a resource must be visited more than can be expected based on availability relative to other species. And a way that I'm going to draw this coming up in this presentation is as a network diagram. And this is a very tiny network with just 3 species, but the proportionate of the relative abundance of each flower species is represented by box width, and the relative abundance of pollinators is represented by this box width, and then interactions are shown by links, and thicker links are more show that interaction is more frequent. Okay, now here's where it gets complicated, and I've put John Acorn's photo here because discussion with him has really he's really been interested in discussing this. Are we getting this conceptually right? So preference is expressed at the individual level. It's an individual insect that chooses a flower. 2 individuals of the same species may not have the same flower preference. They may want to visit different flowers. But on average, individuals within a species may select some flowers over others, which we would interpret as exhibiting preference. So then you can imagine how this could scale up to a community, a pollinator community. So a given pollinator community should exhibit a pattern of preference that reflects species level averages weighted by the proportion of the community made up by each pollinator species. So we can think of the pattern that emerges of pollinator community flower preference should be made up of the average preferences of species weighted by that species abundance. So it does make sense that we should be able to see preferences at the community level, even though it's a property of an individual. But now we have the question, is community level flower preference a property of the group? If that's the case, a given preference by a pollinator community should only hold when group membership remains constant. So that means if in another year you have different abundances of the species making up that community, does that mean that the community's preference will change? Another possibility is that community level flower preference by pollinators is a property of the flower. Now, this would be the case if certain flower species are sort of universally preferred, regardless of insect community membership. And this could happen if there are some traits, flower traits, that are just attractive across every insect taxon. And you would think that because flowers benefit evolutionarily from being visited by insects, they would become adapted to be as attractive as possible, and probably many of them to as many species as possible. So we can think of reasons why that should be the case as well. Now, if flower lists for pollinators work, it must be the case that some flower species are universally attractive to pollinators, because otherwise, what's the point of putting flowers on a list? If what species are attractive to pollinators varies from place to place, a flower list for general flowers for pollinators wouldn't be useful. So either some flower species must be universally attractive, or for region-specific lists, like this one for the Aspen Parkland ecoregion, the pollinator community must be constant enough that community-level preference is fairly constant. So yes, in some years you have fewer of one bee species and more of another bee species, but in general, the community composition of pollinators is similar enough that the pattern of preference holds. So when you think about this, you start to wonder, I wonder if flower lists for pollinators really work to predict what are the best flowers for pollinators. So that's flower lists for pollinators. Now, what happens if we go to the ecology literature? So the ecology literature has, as a consensus, most pollinators are highly generalist, meaning they will visit and use resources from many different flower species. However, observation of plant-pollinator interactions, if you actually watch and record which pollinators visit which plant species, show that abundant flowers receive more visits than less abundant flowers. So does that mean that they're preferred? Generally, that hasn't been assumed. It's generally assumed that that happens just by random chance, because if you're a pollinator going through this patch of flowers, you're just by random chance more likely to encounter a black flower than a yellow flower, and so you're more likely to visit the black flowers than the yellow flowers if you're a generalist and you don't care what you use. So although it has been observed that abundant flowers tend to be visited more, we assume that in trying to understand preference, we have to control for abundance to be able to detect which are actually the preferred flowers. So that has led to the proliferation of preference metrics. Now, all of these, I'm not going to go into how these are calculated or what even exactly they represent, but all of these you can calculate from a data set of observed interactions between pollinators and flowers, and all of these in some way controls for flower relative abundance and comes out with a ranking for you of your list of flower species from most preferred to least preferred. So this, yeah, as I said, this is how you use it. You take this network of pollinator-plant interactions. All of these metrics have their own way of controlling for species relative abundance, and you generate a list where you've got flower species A, B, C, D, etc., and their preference ranking. But the problem is there's so many of them. When we got ready to use one of these, and then we realized, oh, well, which one should we use? There are 5 of them published here. Different authors have used all of them. So we wondered, well, do these all agree with each other? So to test this, we used a data set collected by my former master's student, Sydney Worthy, who's here from Brooks, Alberta. Well, actually from Matthias Research Ranch, which is near Brooks, Alberta. It's in the dry mixed grass prairie ecoregion. And she and her helpers walked 18 transects, which were 30-meter transects, doing 30-minute observations with 2 people, so 60 person hours, every 10 days in 2019. They collected all insects that touched the reproductive parts of a flower, identified the insects, identified the plants, and counted flower abundance along the transect during the time of the survey. This photo, you can't really see any flowers, but there are lots of flowers when you look closely. So this is Janelle identifying insects, and then this is the kind of data set you get. You have a list of pollinator species, a list of flower species, and the number of visits, and you can create this network diagram. So this data set, just to describe it, had 281 pollinator species, 37 flower species, 1,814 interactions, 654 which were unique, and we estimate that it had only 31 to 44% sampling completeness. Now this is because it's incredibly difficult to detect every last interaction. So species interaction sampling is always underbiased. So people tend to report their estimated sampling completeness to give a relative idea of how underbiased it is. Now, this is what the network looked like, and you don't need to read these species names. It's just sort of to show there were a lot of species having a lot of interactions. The purple taxa are bee species, red is Apis mellifera, Coleoptera, pink is Diptera, and then we've got some other more minor groups. So we included everything in this, not just bees, which of course are the best pollinators, but not the only pollinators. Now, this was the answer to the question. Different preference metrics returned different rankings of flower preference by pollinators. So remember, we inputted this network to all these different, well, I guess that's not the right way to say it. We calculated all of these preference metrics from this data set and then produced this table. So we've got flower species listed here, and we've got each flower species ranking by each metric. And so dark blue is a rank of 1. So if all of these metrics returned the same view of which are the preferred flower species, we should see rows of constant color across this heat map, but we don't. So that already shows that we're using this theoretical concept of preference. Everyone has their own index of what preference is as calculated from a network, and they don't agree with each other. So before we move on, I'd just like to draw your attention to 2 species that are going to become important later. One is Achillea millefolium, which is common yarrow. It was ranked as extremely low preference by all these flower visiting insects, by all metrics except this one, but it was still not very high by this one. Symphoricarpus occidentalis is western snowberry. This one ranked a bit more highly. Well, it ranked as first by 2 metrics, but 30th by another one, 21st by another one, 9th by another one. Okay, conclusions from this. Published flower preference metrics do not calculate the same thing. And so we can think of these as each representing a different way of controlling for flower abundance, and therefore an alternate hypothesis about how much we have to control for flower abundance to be able to detect real preference from observed interaction data. Only one of these preference metrics has been field tested, by which I mean observations of interactions were collected, preference metrics were calculated, so the flowers in the dataset were ranked, then those flowers were planted in equal abundance in a common garden, and visitation was observed. And so the metric that was tested was centrality. So these authors found that highly central species, or species that were highly preferred by this metric, did receive more visits and by more species of pollinators than species that were ranked low by this metric. But none of the others have been field tested. So, oh yeah, that's what I just said. So our question was, what about the others? Which one works best? Because if any of these actually worked to make predictions like this study found, that should be an excellent way to choose flowers that we could develop seed for industrial restoration processes, because at the community level, the pollinator community is exhibiting preference for that flower. So we were wondering, which one of these works best? So Rachel, my PhD student, Rachel Pisante, set out to do this. First of all, she asked, are community level flower preferences detectable when flower abundance is controlled? So I've been talking about having to control flower abundance in data, whereas what she did here was experimentally control it. So present flower species in the same abundance and watch them all and watch which ones got visited the most. That should be the very best way to assess preference, because abundance is not confounding anything. Second, she asked, do pollinator community flower preferences hold across ecoregions? So this is getting at that question of, if you change the context, do the preferences hold? Such that we might expect flower lists to be useful across ecoregions. Third, she asked, does any published preference metric successfully predict levels of flower visitation within or between ecoregions? Whoops. And then fourth, she asked, do flowers for pollinators lists successfully predict levels of flower visitation in both ecoregions? So she started with that same 2019 data set from the mixed grassland that we already talked about, calculated the preference metrics. Then based on the rankings given to each flower by each preference metric, she chose the 5 lowest ranked and 5 highest ranked species by each metric, and then collected those, dug them up and put them in plant pots from the Mathias Research Ranch, and presented those flowers to pollinators in equal abundance and observed visitation of all of them. So she did this in 2 ecoregions. Here's Rachel and her helpers doing this in the dry mixed grass ecoregion. Now, this is the same ecoregion from which this data set was collected. So the preference metrics should work best, have the best predictive ability for this data set. They also did this in the Aspen Parkland ecoregion, which is the site was 308 kilometers, 2 ecoregions away from the source of the data from which the preferences were calculated. Oops. The Aspen Parkland ecoregion also had completely different flower visitor species composition, except for 2 hoverfly species. So Rachel and others caught totally different species visiting flowers in the solar farm in the Aspen Parkland, as compared to in the dry mixed grass prairie. And all flower species used in this study occur naturally in both ecoregions, except for one does not occur in Aspen Parkland. Another thing to note is that, so the Aspen Parkland ecoregion sites there were 2 of them, they were both in urban areas, so that might affect things as well. So then third, she asked, does presence on many flower lists indicate that flowers will have higher visitation? So she did a systematic search for flowers for pollinator lists for Alberta, found 23 lists that did not include non-native ornamental flowers and were designed primarily for insect pollinators. And then she tested whether the number of lists that a flower species was on predicted the number of pollinator visits to that flower species. So basically, do lists collectively have predictive value? The reason why she didn't test any individual list is because there were 23 of them and they ranged from having 6 to 107 plant species. So this seemed like the best way to sort of test the idea that expert opinion might be better than these preference metrics, because compiling all the lists should be like compiling expert opinion. Okay, these were the networks that she generated from watching her potted plants in the mixed grasslands and the Aspen Parkland. I'm not going to dwell on the details here. Here's the answer to the first question. Pollinator community level flower preferences were detectable. So what I'm showing here is the flower species, the number of visits on the x-axis, and the error bars are 95% confidence intervals. So what these confidence intervals represent is we would expect this flower to have received anywhere within that confidence interval number of visits, just based on the amount of minutes it was observed for, because different species bloomed for different amounts of time, so they weren't all observed for the same amount of time. So if a flower species had a number of visits that's above to the right of the end of the confidence interval, that means it was visited significantly more than expected by chance. And if it had a number of visits below the end of the confidence interval, to the left of the end of the confidence interval, that means it was visited significantly less often than expected by chance. So the flowers that emerged as significantly preferred, meaning selected more than just you'd expect by chance, were Achillea millefolium, common yarrow, which I've pictured here. It's got 3 flies on it in this picture. This was one of Rachel's observations. Melolotus albus, now this is white sweet clover, which is actually not native. It's a non-native forage species. Symphoricarpus occidentalis, this one is western snowberry, and Rosa arkansas, prairie rose. Then there were 4 significantly unpreferred. Now, the healthy, mediocre, and unhealthy is because when we put these flowers in pots, some of them fared better than others. So this accounts for that. Now, so this is interesting because this is the best sort of evidence of which flowers are preferred. Our calculations from preference metrics were based on this observation of a pattern of flower visitation. What do we think is preferred if we control for abundance? But what this figure right here is showing is if you present these flowers in equal abundance, what gets chosen more than would be expected by chance. So we see that Achillea millefolium and Symphoricarpus occidentalis, which were the ones I highlighted on that previous preference metric figure, both of those, especially Achillea millefolium, were ranked very not rank it highly. Okay, so that's the mixed grass prairie. Moving to the Aspen Parkland, again, there were some preferred and some unpreferred species, lots of neutral species. But Symphoricarpus occidentalis and Achillea millefolium were again significantly preferred, but this time the other one was prairie goldenrod. So this allows us to answer that question: do preferences hold across contexts? So not really was the answer. 5 of 16, or 31% of plant species, had the same preference designation in both ecoregions. So the preference designation held in only 31% of cases. Yarrow and western snowberry were significantly preferred in both ecoregions, and white sweet clover and prairie rose were also preferred in grasslands, whereas prairie goldenrod was also preferred in parkland. Now, how did the preference metrics do? we found that the preference metrics that controlled for flower abundance did not have a predictive ability. So what these figures are, we'll start with mixed grasslands, which is this first panel. We've got mean number of visits on the y-axis, and we've got each preference metric on the x-axis, and yellow is preferred. So this was, the metric said that flower species should be preferred, and brown says the metric said that flower species should not be preferred. So what we'd expect to see if preference metrics worked is the yellow bar be significantly higher than the brown bar, but we actually see the opposite for several metrics. The only metrics that we do see that for are this one, the mass action hypothesis, and PSD, which is Shannon diversity of flower visitors. So and we found that looking into, well, why did those ones work? We noticed that the metrics that were correlated with flower abundance and flower number of visits in the 2019 dataset had predictive ability in the grasslands. But when you look down at the Aspen parkland, there's a trend towards those same metrics being predictive, but the predictions, the differences weren't significant in number of visits between preferred versus unpreferred species. So so that was an interesting result. Given that it was only the metrics that didn't control for abundance very well, we thought, well, how does just flower abundance do at predicting number of visits? So we found that both flower abundance and number of visits in the 2019 dataset predicted number of visits in the grasslands in 2023. So what we have here is if it was one of the most abundant species on the grassland transects in 2019, it received more visits, significantly more visits when put out into potted plants in 2023 than if it was one of the least abundant flowers on the landscape in 2019. And that was the best predictive ability. That was better than any preference metric. Number of visits also significantly predicted in the grasslands, but not in the Aspen parkland. Number of visits did not predict visits. Only flower abundance in 2019 predicted number of visits in 2023. But this is quite neat that it did so even in the Aspen parkland. So this difference is saying that the more abundant flowers on the landscape in the dry mixed grass prairie in 2019 were significantly more likely to be visited in the Aspen parkland than less abundant flowers on the dry mixed grass prairie in 2019. So that was totally unexpected. Now let's look at flower lists. We found that presence on multiple flower lists predicted visitation in the grassland, but not in the parkland. So this is what we would have expected to see if lists worked. This showed that lists did not have predictive ability in the Aspen parkland. Now that was also a surprise because we included lists that applied to any region of Alberta and just pooled them all together. But probably the reason why this was predictive in the grasslands and not in Aspen parkland is because 11 of the 23 lists were actually created for grasslands. So our pooling of lists actually had a grassland bias. However, I'm not sure if that fully exonerates flower lists because all tested flower species are also naturally found in the parkland too. So why shouldn't lists be predictive in the parkland, in the grassland area of the parklands as well, which is where we tested these, except for the one flower species. And yeah, so we found some success for flower lists. Just taking a bit closer look at this, here's an example of the flower list data. So common yarrow was found on 12 flower lists for pollinators. It was preferred in both ecoregions from the empirical data. Let's look at another one. Common harebell, Campanula rotundifolia, appeared on 11 lists saying plant this for pollinators. It did not come out as preferred. It was just neutral, not visited more than expected by chance in these ecoregions. What about another one? So 10 prairie goldenrod also was on a lot of flower lists. It was highly preferred in one of the ecoregions, but Symphoricarpus occidentalis, western snowberry, was only on 6 flower lists, and it was the most highly preferred in one ecoregion and highly preferred in another. So conclusions from this: very few flower species were universally attractive to flower visiting insects. Just by universally meaning across ecoregions, just 2 of them were western snowberry and yarrow. So that's 2 of 20, or 10% of species were significantly preferred by different pollinator communities 308 kilometers apart in different ecoregions. And these were on 52% and 26% of flower lists respectively. So it's not that every flower list identified, oh, these are great. Some of them did, many of them didn't. preference metrics did not make successful predictions unless they did not control for flower abundance in the original data set. They didn't work across ecoregions. And flower lists individually were not very predictive, but presence on multiple lists for a given ecoregion, specifically grasslands, was more predictive. However, of all these things, the best predictor of high visitation in 2023 was that flower species abundance on the grassland landscape in 2019. So that's very interesting. And the question is why? In the grassland landscape, it sort of makes sense that if pollinators are used to encountering a species, they'll get used to handling it. Perhaps they'll develop a search image within their lives for it. So even though surrounding our study plots where we placed our potted plant, there actually weren't high abundances of snowberry or yarrow, perhaps their general prevalence on the landscape down there makes them popular among flower visiting insects. However, yeah, why did abundance in the grasslands predict visitation in aspen parkland? That we're still digging into, and we're looking at looking for data on flower relative abundances in grassland areas. The thing is, in our study sites, which were in Edmonton, certainly snowberry and yarrow are not the most common species encountered. So that's a bit more of a mystery. What are the implications of this study? For ecological theory, we found that abundant flowers don't get visited more just by chance. Here, we found that insects actually preferred normally abundant flowers. So that's something that usually is not assumed in the ecological literature. And we also found that community level preference is more a property of the insect community than of the flower. The implications for restoration for pollinators is that there aren't very many universally best plants for pollinators. We found only 2 of them. And then flower lists were an imperfect guide, even collectively. Preference metrics didn't work. So what I would recommend in terms of what flower species should we work on seed development of for restoration projects would be native flowers that are naturally abundant from the region that the native seed is being developed for. Okay, now I'm running quickly out of time. However, I will carry on. So the next thing I want to talk about is a flower species with high pollinator community supporting function should also be used by pollinators that visit many other flower species. So this one, this is slightly different than the first one. So the preference idea sort of was less successful than we might have thought it would be, but this is another way in which flowers can be important for pollinators. So we can ask, which are the whole network supporting flower species? So now we're not talking about preference. We're asking, are there flower things that hold things together over the season? So what I mean by that is, are there flower species that support pollinator species that visit many other flower species? So that that flower species will support pollinators that then pollinate a lot of other flower species. And then another way in which a flower species could hold the network together is to fill temporal gaps. And so this in general would maintain the network structure. From network theory, certain nodes within any network have more structural importance than others. So network importance can be measured with another set of metrics. These are centrality, including degree centrality, closeness centrality, betweenness centrality, Shannon diversity of interaction partners. That's not usually thought of as a centrality metric, but it's the same concept. So all of those are saying central nodes that interact with a lot of other species should be very important to the whole community. Module forming species. Now, this is saying that a flower that sort of forms a module of closely interacting species that doesn't interact as much with the rest of the network is very structurally important locally in the network. And module connecting species should be important because they connect those modules of clusters of interactions such that the whole thing is a network instead of 2 separate networks. So these are all the ways in which nodes within a network can be important. So if we apply this to plant-pollinator interaction networks, which emerge as the important flower species? I now just want to talk about the importance of flower visitors beyond pollinators. So in this talk, I've actually been talking about all insects visiting flowers because I think conservation of flower visiting insects in general is interesting because these are highly diverse, very behaviorally diverse, morphologically diverse, interesting, animals that are worth conserving. But the use of the term pollinator indicates that we're interested in these mainly because of what they do for plants. And many flower-visiting insects aren't actually great pollinators. The more hairy an insect is, the better a pollinator is. So bees are excellent pollinators, but many flies, all of these pictures here are of flies, can be good pollinators, but many flies and some other flower-visiting insects perform other important ecosystem services, like being natural enemies of crop pests. Syrphids in one entire subfamily have predaceous larvae that eat aphids, for example. And this is a tachinid fly. Now, tachinids are enormously important natural enemies of economically important pests of many of our major crops in the Canadian prairies. So these are all flower-visiting insects that are not usually thought of as pollinators, but still functionally important. Just as an example, my student Carmen compiled a list of all the known interactions between economically important crop pests of canola, so that's these species down here, and their natural enemies, and all of the Diptera and the Hymenoptera as adults need to feed on flowers. So if we're going to support natural enemy control of crop pests in our prairie provinces, we should be thinking about flowers for natural enemies as well. Okay, so this is why my student Pilar decided to focus on natural enemies. So again, we're asking which flower species emerge as the most important to the whole insect-flower interaction network. So she again started with the 2019 grassland network, reduced it to just the natural enemy flower interactions, which was mostly deleting all the bees, but she actually poured through and looked for evidence that each species was a natural enemy, was predatory or parasitic. Calculated the network importance metrics, ranked the flower species by their network importance, tested whether flower species network importance varied across the season, and she did this by creating two versions of the network, which I will come to in a bit, and then tested whether flowers' network importance was explained by their traits or their abundance. So she looked to see what she'd find the same thing as Rachel. Are more abundant flower species more important? And also, are there certain traits of flowers that indicate that they're going to be more important? Now, here are the results. The two empirically most preferred flowers by all flower visitors came out as the best for natural enemies too. Symphoricarpus occidentalis and Achillea millefolium, yarrow and western snowberry were at the top of the list by 3 metrics, the second by 2 metrics, and sixth by 1. So this is actually an independent route at arriving at the same thing, because remember, the preference metrics calculated from this data set did not rank these species highly, just the empirical tests did. So this actually kind of lends support for this idea that network importance metrics may be a good way to get at flower importance. Okay, so this was all interactions pooled together across the season. Looking at network importance in each plant's own phenological network, which means creating a network of just the interactions that each one plant species was blooming for. So it's not pooling together all the interactions across the season, some of which wouldn't actually occur at the same time. So this is more of a temporal parsing to create networks and then calculate plants' importance in its own network. A slightly different ranking emerges, but Symphoricarpus occidentalis and Achillea millefolium are close to the top again. Same with Rosa arcansa that we saw in the preference stuff. Looking at flower species network importance through time, so this is a very overwhelming graph, but we've got plant species here, and we've got time across this x-axis, and then there's a color in the plant species row for the whole time that it's blooming. And what that color is shows its network importance. So pink is, at that time, that plant was playing a very important role in the network. So you can see that Symphoricarpus occidentalis is the only one that achieves pink anytime, but it's only 2 times. It's in May and it's in July. Other times it's less important. It actually even achieves blue, which is like least important to the network. So looking across all the plant species, you can see that for all plant species, their network importance changed a lot across months. Now, could network importance be explained by traits? So, you don't need to be able to read everything here, but basically what we're plotting on every y-axis here is a different importance metric or unimportance metric, and then a trait value. So whether it's flower diameter, corolla depth, etc., petal length. And so what you'd expect to see if there's a nice, clean, linear relationship is like as trait value, for example, flower size increases, flower importance increases. But we don't see that. We see complex nonlinear relationships. So traits are important, but it's pretty hard to say how. It's pretty context dependent, it looks. Now, did flower abundance explain network importance? Okay, so again, we have importance metric on the y-axis and flower abundance on the x-axis across all the 6 importance metrics. Now, let's look first at the brown lines. The pooled interactions showed this positive relationship. More abundant flowers had higher network importance. But remember, pooling interactions across the whole season is kind of artificial because it means you're putting into one network interactions that don't actually occur together in time. So when you calculate importance in phenonets, these phenological networks, flower abundance has complex nonlinear relationships with flower importance. In fact, rarer flower species, so towards the left side of the x-axis, like for example here, can sometimes achieve high importance. So importance goes up and down, even though generally up with abundance, some rare flower species achieve temporary high network importance. So conclusions from this: flower network importance metrics calculated for natural enemy flower visitors concluded that the empirically preferred species, Western snowberry and yarrow, also have important network supporting roles. Flower species importance for flower natural enemy networks changed seasonally, and flower traits had complex nonlinear relationships with species network importance. Importantly, less abundant flower species can have high seasonal network importance. So what are the implications? I think a cool one from this is that via a different conceptual approach, thinking about network importance rather than preference, the same top flowers for supporting insect visitors emerged, which were Western snowberry and yarrow. Now, this, however, is kind of like developing of elaborate hypotheses. We have not field tested these predictions. We've calculated a bunch of network importance metrics and applied them to it. Applying them to a data set, but we haven't tested, okay, do these importance metrics actually result in more diverse pollinator communities? So that would be the next step, empirical testing of these rankings to confirm the utility of network importance as a way of assessing flower importance for natural enemies. But what this concept is basically is that a flower species importance for insects results from its visitor diversity, its the temporal shifting of availability of other flowers, and the temporal shifting of insect visitor communities. So network importance metrics actually wrap up all these complexities sort of into a nice package. Network importance metrics applied to especially phenological networks are a way to rank flowers by their importance based on all of these complex factors together. So that's what the value of looking at network importance should be. But it does need empirical testing, just like the preference metrics needed empirical testing and actually failed when they got empirically tested. Okay, I think I have like 2 minutes to talk about this, but I just wanted to address this since this is such a big issue in restoration for pollinators, is non-native flower species. So are these good or bad from the pollination perspective and the pollinator perspective? So this is work by my master's student Riley and these results that were mostly from my undergrad student Sam, because Riley's still doing her insect IDs. So Sam observed the 6 study plots around the solar farm in this enhanced seed area that had a range of non-native flower cover. So the mean non-native flower cover across all the survey times ranged from 0 to 27% or so. And he observed, how does insect flower visitor floral constancy change? So you might expect that when you have more non-native flowers, insects will get distracted by them, get attracted over to them, and not be constant as to which species they're visiting. Floral constancy is the habit of an insect of visiting subsequent visits to the same species. And that is extremely important for an insect being a good pollinator. So if non-native plants reduce floral constancy, that would be a bad thing for pollination of native plants. However, Sam found no change to floral constancy on native flowers as non-native cover increased. He also found that higher levels of non-native cover in a plot attracted pollinators to the plot. However, so did total flower cover. So this could be a total flower cover effect more than that. It's just the fact that these were non-native. But that is nevertheless beneficial because more insects arriving near to a native flower, the more chance the native flower will be visited. Looking at specifically at the one native species that was in all the plots, yarrow. So this figure is showing number of pollinator species visiting yarrow as mean non-native flower cover increases. And so he found fewer species visit yarrow, fewer different species visited yarrow, the higher the percent cover of non-native flowers. And here are two networks that show this. So this is the pooled interactions from plot 1. There were 6 plots, but I'm just showing you 2 of them that illustrate this. Here's pooled interactions from plot 2. So yarrow is this green box in the corner of both of them. So you can see that where there are no non-native flowers, which are the purple flowers, there's lots of species visiting yarrow. All these 3 species with stars switch over to visiting canola or alfalfa in plots that had canola and alfalfa. So they get distracted from being interested in yarrow and going over to alfalfa. So non-native flowers in restoration settings have complex effects on visitation of native flowers from the plant perspective, in that they can attract more pollinators to the patch, but they can actually remove some of the species that are interested in visiting that native flower. Pollinators, however, visit non-native flowers readily, and so non-native flowers can actually support visiting insects in the absence of native flowers. And an example of this, I actually just want to go back to this slide. Here is the solar farm just covered in yellow sweet clover, which is non-native, and sow thistle. At this time, it was just humming with insects. There were bees everywhere. We were doing timed observations, and we just kept having to stop the clock and take bees out of our nets and flies. It was just humming with insects. Then the solar farm wanted to get rid of all those non-native species, so sprayed everything except our observation plots and their forb plots. And later, the solar farm was just devoid of insects. It was totally silent. No insects were visiting the native flowers that were left. So in that way, you can really see that non-native flowers are definitely better than no flowers for supporting flower visiting insects. So I'm nearly done. I'm just gonna conclude choosing, sum up what we've talked about. In choosing flowers for beneficial insects and restoration, flower preferences are detectable, but seem mostly context dependent. Our big finding was insects preferred naturally abundant flowers. So commercial development of seed for these is likely to benefit a lot of pollinators. And flower species importance for natural enemy communities varies seasonally. At certain times of the year, rare flowers play important community supporting roles. So there's definitely more research to do. These last 2 points kind of support the idea that we already know diversity is important, because the more species you have, the more you'll have some abundant, some rare, and those rare species will play some role. I'm not leaving all that much time for questions, so I will end there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Carol. That was awesome. I'll just jump right in the interest of time here. So in the era of fire management, snowberry has been able to propagate much further than it would naturally. Could it be that the pollinators who rely on that species have also grown in abundance?
That's very interesting. Yes, it could be. The one thing is that almost no pollinator relies just on snowberries. So, yeah, but so could that be a reason for these results, you're wondering? I suspect not, because I think, I mean, I don't know. I guess it probably depends on where in the landscape you are. Near those proliferating snowberry patches, probably more than just anywhere. I don't think that would have affected our results in Edmonton, because it wasn't super abundant and dominant in Edmonton. But that's a very interesting question.
All right. Do the number of visits result in increased seed production, therefore increased flower abundance over time?
As an explanation for this, could be. It definitely could be. Yes. So is pollinator preference the reason for abundance on flowers in the landscape, and so it's like the pollinator preference caused the flower abundance? That definitely could be the case. However, that doesn't really explain our results in the Aspen Parkland region, unless when you look at the landscape level, the same flower species are abundant. We've tried to do that looking at Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute data from their study plots, and we haven't found that it's overwhelmingly the case. It looks like relative abundances do tend to differ quite a lot between the grassland areas of the two ecoregions.
All right, maybe one more. You mentioned that there were a lot of bees present visiting the non-native flowers. Were these native bees or honeybees?
One of the bars, which was very small, which means not many visits, was honeybees. Most of them were native bees. So yes, native bees did visit a lot of non-native flowers at the solar farm. Interestingly, we did a study that I didn't talk about here on the effects of honeybees on wild pollinator visitation of flowers in the grassland ecoregion, and found that even high honeybee densities didn't noticeably shift the structure of the interaction network between wild pollinators and plants. And that seemed to be because honeybees dominated non-native species like Astragalus cicer, Cicer milkvetch, and one other, I've forgotten what the other species was. But we also washed pollen off of honeybees and native bees in that study, and the results are just coming out for that now, but it does seem like native species have way more native flower pollen on them, and honeybees have mostly non-native pollen. So yeah, we found native bees visiting non-native flowers, but this is in a restoration setting with tons of non-native flowers and high cover. In a more natural setting like this grassland, there does seem to be more focus on the native flowers by native bees.
Awesome. Thanks, Carol. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Do you have any concluding remarks there, Lee?
Oh, apparently I've disappeared into my screen. But as far as I know, the website will be in after the recording is done. It will be posted to our website. So for those that would like to review it, you can. Or if you missed the first part of it, you can watch the whole thing. As well as on our website, there's a lot more resources for native grassland work. And as well as I mentioned before, please sign up on our mailing list if you don't already have it. With that, I'd like to really thank Dr. Frost for presenting to us today. Super interesting. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for joining us, everyone.